I'm going to leave the safety stuff for a little bit because today it's time to talk about technological advancements. The sort of thing that a team would come up with or a manufacturer would come up with, and then everybody starts scrambling to make their own version because it will gain them just a simple half a tenth or so over their rivals. And then it starts to go down that rabbit hole of, will it get banned? Will they allow it? Will it become something that's just a standard? That sort of thing. And I think I've probably done most of them by now. McLaren's second brake pedal, the carbon fibre monocoque, the Cosworth DFE, blown diffusers, double diffusers, Mercedes DAS system from a few years ago. Okay, I haven't done that one yet, but there's also Frick, mass dampers, active suspension, the list continues. The stuff that was so good that soon everybody had to have that particular thing, or get it banned depending on how much the other teams had to spend to over-engineer it for no reason. Second brake pedal comes to mind. But in the late 1980s, a car turned up on the Formula 1 grid that would, in a way, change motorsport forever, because a piece of engineering wizardry on board would become standard across all single-seaters over the next 35 years or so, and be present on even road cars because of how much of a game changer it was. Well, actually, hold that thought for a second because that's something we need to address. But either way, this story centres around the Ferrari 640 and the advent of flappy paddle gearboxes in motorsport. John Barnard had recently moved from McLaren to Ferrari, and the Ferrari 640 would be the first car he'd be the technical director for. Also on the design team was Enrique Scalabroni, who was the chief designer, Henri Durand, the head of aero, and Claudio Lombardi, who was the engine designer. Barnard had left McLaren at the end of 1986 and had done a bit of designing through 1987, and since Ferrari hadn't won a race since the 1985 German Grand Prix, Barnard basically had any demands he had answered, since Ferrari was just that desperate. Ferrari gave him a chunk of money and he set up an office in Guildford, Surrey, about 30 miles from London, and then set up the Ferrari Guildford Technical Office in early 1988. Now what's funny here is that Guildford Technical Office has an abbreviation, GTO, so it became the Ferrari GTO, which was actually Barnard's favourite Ferrari. The goal was, obviously, to return Ferrari to the top of the pile. With the turbo regulations coming to an end, Gustav Brunner had been given the task of designing the 87 and 88 cars, while Barnard was free to make the most of the non-turbo 89 car. And given that Barnard had arrived at Ferrari in 87, the car for 87 had already been designed, and using his ideas would have cost too much. So he was just left to do the 89 car because of just, well, convenience and necessity. Only 2 more seasons of turbos left to endure for the Scuderia. Barnard had one problem to deal with though. He'd annoyed quite a large amount of the Ferrari workforce because he was in an office in England while everybody else was in Italy. Other non-Italians like Harvey Postlethwaite and later on Jean Todt, Nigel Stepney and so on all moved to Italy, but he didn't. But for Barnard it was better for him because he could work in peace. The Italian press would absolutely eviscerate Ferrari if they didn't win, and being in England, he didn't have to read any of it because no internet at that time. He'd also stopped the other team members drinking wine at lunch whenever there was any testing on at Maranello, which also annoyed people. But looking at that through modern eyes, probably for the best. But everything was partially forgiven when Barnard's design won the season-opening Brazilian Grand Prix in Rio de Janeiro, and that was because the gearbox was completely different to everybody else's. In 1988, Ferrari had tried to dispense with the traditional H-pattern gearbox, the one seen in manual cars. They had actually tested a very primitive system back in the late 1970s with Gilles Villeneuve, and while the system had worked, Villeneuve hated it. Villeneuve said that the H-pattern would be more reliable than the system that Mauro Forghieri had designed, and he was, for a time, right. But Ferrari wasn't the inventor of such a system because the Chaparral 2C had been fitted with one in the 1960s because that car had an adjustable rear wing, similar to a DRS system in Formula 1 today. I'm trying to find a picture of one, but I don't know if there's one that exists that I can use, so if I can't, I'll just pop up a picture of a similar car. Long story short, Chaparral had fitted a clutchless semi-auto gearbox to the car so the driver could use his left foot, which would normally be clutching, to use this DRS system. As mentioned, drivers up to this point had been using those H-pattern shifters, with the shifter being on the right-hand side of the car in most Formula 1 cars, prototypes and sports cars, probably due to the fact that most of these drivers were right-handed. I know that BRM in the 1960s had it on their left-hand side because, well, British, and that's where we have our gear shifters being on the other side of the car to places like America and Canada and places like that. And it is a bit weird though because I'm left-handed, so doing that feels natural. Doing it the other way, like I had to in Spain and Canada, not so much. To change gears, it was the same as it is in a road car. Accelerate and then lift off the throttle, push the clutch in, select the next gear, bring the clutch back up and get back on the throttle. Now some guys, depending on the gearboxes they had, might have been able to just simply lift and slam the gears in, which is from what I gather what they were doing by the late 1980s anyway. It's what they did on the way back down that's fun. If they were just relying on the engine braking, then they'd be blowing gearboxes and engines left, right and centre because of that huge spike in engine revs just taking it past the red line. The car would also be out of control because of the torque being sent to the rear wheels. So what they had to do was use this nifty little system that stopped all of that from happening. In the words of my brother, I only have 2 feet, how the hell am I supposed to do this? But it's something that's actually pretty simple, but people seem to overcomplicate it because, well, they can, and it makes them sound like they're better drivers. They'd use something called heel and toe braking, where the driver steps on the brake with the right foot, then goes down the gears as normal. However, when the gear is selected, the driver will use the side of the right foot that is still on the brake to blip the throttle with the right foot to put the revs to pretty much where they were before, which means there isn't that spike in engine revs that will put the rear of the car out of control. Heel toe, blipping, rev matching, these are all interchangeable names. For a masterclass in this, watch the V8 supercars from about 10 years ago, especially at Bathurst. There's some pedal cam footage of Cam Waters and others doing it, and then there's Senna at Monaco, obviously. Thing is with those V8 supercars is the drivers can heel and toe, or they can just slam it into gear and blip with the right foot with no clutch required, but they can clutch and make it slightly easier and consistent and save on wear in longer races. There's a video online of Alex Rossi driving around Kota in an old Lotus 49 doing the lift and slam TM method, and it just looks weird because we've always been led to believe that it was all heel and toe and clutching at that point. And then you've obviously got the video of Senna driving his McLaren around Monaco one-handed with his gear shifter in his right hand and just changing. Now, he could have also been doing the lift and slam TM method, but he could have easily as well have been doing the clutch method because Monaco has a lot of gear changes and he might need to save on the dog rings. It's just a shame that GoPros didn't exist at that time, really. Barnard had realised that if he could get the system working, there'd be other advantages on top of that. Firstly, the engines now had a different working range for power delivery, and with the cars now being so fast, if Barnard could get the drivers to keep their hands on the wheel at all times, the cars would be more under control. The second reason would simply be aero. The cockpits had to be pretty wide to accommodate the H-pattern lever and allow room to have the driver's right hand, or left hand in the old BRMs, to do the shifting. Eliminate the need for a shifter, then that's a narrower cockpit design that'll punch a better hole in the air. It's why that Ferrari in 1989 had that really pointy nose. A system had been tried and tested during 1988 but had never raced. When the new management came in after Enzo's death in the August of 1988, Barnard had to stand his ground, convinced that this system was the future, and eventually they let him continue working on it. The gearbox worked by using electro-hydraulic valves, which was something used in the aircraft industry at the time. The actual science baffles me and scares me, but what this system was able to do was be able to send the car into the next gear up or down faster than any human being could do it with an H-pattern. Milliseconds wasn't happening yet, that would be a few years down the line, but this box was also able to give a consistent shift every single time, simply from the driver pulling a lever on the back of his wheel. It's very similar to one of these, actually. Obviously this is a more modern formula type of wheel, they would have used something a little bit more similar to this, but the concept is still pretty much the same. On the back you've got these 4 paddles. I mean, this is the dual stage clutch that they would have had in about 2014, 2015, which can be adjusted with this little knob here, but on the back you've got these paddles. That one sends the gear up, that one sends the gear down, so it's just this. Easy, really, but faster. And the car with this new gearbox went and won the first race of the season in Rio at the start of the 1989 season. The other teams in Formula 1 didn't think this would ever work and that the H-pattern was still a more reliable way of doing things, but Ferrari had proven them wrong. For a time, anyway. Because Mansell would not score points until the French Grand Prix, but he would then finish every other race he did finish on the podium. Berger was the same, but he had a worse time with the car. He wouldn't finish a race until the Italian Grand Prix where he was second, but would then win in Portugal and finish second in Spain. For reference here, Mansell was disqualified at the Canadian Grand Prix for starting the race too early along with Alessandro Nannini. It wasn't a simple jump start, he really did start the race too early. It's something that you might want to look up yourselves, or I could just do a video in the future on it. And then he was disqualified again in Portugal because he'd reversed in the pit lane and then copped a 1 race ban after the fact because he'd ignored the black flags and then wiped out Senna. Berger, meanwhile, had suffered his fiery crash at the San Marino Grand Prix and had to miss the race in Monaco due to having burns on his hands. He was able to get back in the car sooner than expected because the flappy paddle nature of the gearbox meant that he didn't need to get back into the swing of using an H pattern. He could just use the ends of his fingers to change gear instead of using his whole hand to grip the gear knob. And Barnard had found out around the time of the Canadian Grand Prix that the problems with the gearbox weren't necessarily due to the gearbox itself, but because of the electric system that was powering the electro-hydraulic, system. They figured out it was just a very simple fix. They just needed a bigger battery, which Magneti Marelli was able to provide. When the Ferrari worked, it was as good, if not better, than the championship-winning McLarens of Senna and Prost. But there was not a single race on the calendar where both cars finished. Mansell, as mentioned, had the better reliability, but Ferrari would have to settle for third in the constructors behind McLaren and Williams with 59 points. But they'd managed to win 3 races that season, which was better than the single race they'd won the year before, even if that required some divine intervention from lapped traffic taking out Senna's McLaren. Reliability for 1990 improved, and with Prost in the team, Ferrari almost had a drivers' championship, and now the other teams on the grid could see that there was indeed the potential for these new gearboxes to take over the world. 1991 would be the final season an H-pattern car would take the title, as F1 entered the brief era of active suspension and fully automated systems. But when these systems were banned at the end of 1993, virtually everybody was now on a flappy paddle gearbox. Teams then started migrating the clutches to the rear of the steering wheel to allow the cars to have an easier time standing still on inclines, so that they had the layouts they do today. And in 1995, only the 40 team had the old-style H-pattern shifter. And now, fun fact time! In 1989, one of the drivers who tested the flappy paddle system at Maranello was Roberto Moreno, who was in that 40 in 1995. By 1996, everybody had one, and everybody has had one since. Now, these gearboxes have evolved to the point where it's instantaneous shifting without doing any damage to the dog rings. No dual clutches like a modern automatic road car. They just slam it in with the computer cutting the throttle for that split second to get the gear to go in. And on the way down, a computer has to do the blipping because it's all happening too fast for a human to keep up. Although I can't find out when all of that started, it might have been when Williams was using the auto gearboxes in 1992, but it could have been as early as 1991, but I'm fairly certain that Mansell and Berger had to blip in 1989. The reason all this came about is because of Barnard's belief that it would work. In his Beyond the Grid interview, he had to have that belief, threatening to quit Ferrari if the new bosses didn't let him carry on with it, while also having to have that idea in the back of his mind of what he was going to do if this new thing turned out to be rubbish. As such, he got it working. And now it's the standard. Le Mans prototypes, Indy cars, GT3 cars, GTLM cars, GT4s, Porsche Cup cars, Junior Formula cars, and obviously Formula 1 cars. They're all using these flappy paddles on the backs of their steering wheels. They could go back to H patterns, but what would be the point? This is faster. And that's what matters. So then, a look at the innovation rather than the invention of the flappy paddle gearbox in motorsport. If this has taught you something new, then like the video so I know I've done a good job, and for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything I do around here. Massive thanks to the kind folk at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help out at a more personal level, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and my affiliate links in the description, and I'll put some F1 store deals in a pinned comment for you too. Also under this video is memberships if that's a thing you want to do, as well as super thanks for a one-off tip. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.